Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out Edgar Allan Poe. This is called J. Fenimore Cooper. Wynnedote, or the Hunted Knoll, is in its general features precisely similar to the novels enumerated in the title. It is a forest subject, and when we say this, we give assurance that the story is a good one. For Mr. Cooper has been known to fail either in the forest or upon the sea. The interest, as usual, has no reference to the plot, of which indeed our novelist seems altogether regardless or incapable, but depends first upon the nature of the theme, secondly upon the Robinson Crusoe-like detail of the management, and thirdly upon the frequently repeated portraiture of the half-civilized Indian. In saying that the interest depends first upon the nature of the theme, we mean to suggest that this theme, life in the wilderness, is one of the intrinsic and universal interests appealing to the heart of the man in all phrases, a theme that, like of the life upon the ocean, so unfailing, unprevalent in its power of arresting and absorbing attention, that while success or popularity is, with such a subject, expect as a matter of course, a failure of which might properly regard as conclusive evidence of imbecility on the part of the author. These questions have been handled usque ad nauseam, and thus through the instinctive perception of the universal interest which appertains to them, the writer distrusts of his powers can scarcely do better than discuss either one of these authors. The man of genius will rarely, should never undertake either, first because of both excessively hackneyed, or secondly because of the reader never fails to inform his opinion of the book, to make discount, either wittingly or unwittingly, that the intrinsic interest which is inseparable from the subject and the independent of the matter in which it is treated. The very few and very dull indeed are those who do not understand this instantaneously perceive the distinction, and thus there are two great classes of fiction, a popular and a widely circulated class read with pleasure, but without admiration, in which the author is lost or forgotten or remembered, if at all, and with is something very neatly akin to contempt, and then a class not so popular nor so widely diffused, in which at every paragraph arises a distinct and highly pleasurable interest, springing from our perception and appreciation of the skill employed or the genius evinced in the composition. After perusal of the one class, we think solely of the book. After reading the other, chiefly of the author. The former class leads to popularity and the latter to fame. The former class, the books sometimes live while the author usually die. In the latter, even when the words perish, the man survives. Among American writers of the less generally circulated, but more worthy and more artistical fictions, we may mention Mr. Brockton Brown, Mr. John Neal, Mr. Sims, Mr. Hawthorne. At the head of the more popular division, we place Mr. Cooper. The Hunted Knoll, without pretending to detail facts about a narrative of fictitious events, similarly in nearly all respects to occurrences which actually happened during the opening scenes of the Revolution and at other epochs of our history. It pictures of dangers, difficulties, and distresses of the large family living completely insulated in the forest. Their tale commences with a description of the region of which lies in the angle formed by the junction of the Mohawk with the Hudson, extending as far south as the lines of the Pennsylvania and west as the verst of the vast rolling plains which composes New York City, western New York, a region of which the novelist has already frequently written and of the whole of which, with a trivial exception, was a wilderness before the Revolution. Within this district and on the creek running into the Undula, a Captain Willingby purchases an estate of patent, and there are retirees and his family and dependents to pass the chaos of his life to an agricultural pursuit. There has been an offer of the British to, but after serving many years, has sold his commission and purchased one of his only son, Robert, who alone does not accompany the party into the forest. This party consists of the captain himself, his wife, his daughter, Belia, and adopted daughter, Maud Meredith, an invalid sergeant, Joyce, and her under served under the captain, the Presbyterian preacher, Mr. Woods, a Scottish mason, Jamie Allen, an Irish laborer, Michael O'Hearn, a Connecticut man, Joel Strides, 4 Negroes, Old Penn and Young Penn, Big Smash and Little Smash, 8 X-Men, a house carpenter, a millwright, etc., etc. Besides these, a Tuscarora Indian called Nick or Winnedot accompanies the expedition. The Indian who figures largely in the story and gives it its title may be considered as the principal character, the one chiefly elaborated. He is an outcast from the tribe and has been known to Captain Willoughby for 30 years and is compound of all the goods and bad qualities which make up the character of the half-civilized Indian. He does not remain with the settlers. He appears and reappears at intervals upon the scene. Nearly the whole of the first volume is occupied with a detailed account of the entire estate purchased, which is termed the Hutted Knoll, from the natural mound from which the principal house is built, and the progressive arrangements and improvements. Toward the close of the volume of the Revolution commences the party of the Knoll are besieged by a band of savages and rebels with whom an understanding exists on the part of Joel Strides, the Yankee. The trader, instigated by the hopes of possessing Captain Willoughby's estate, should it be confiscated, brings about a series of deflections from the party of the settlers, and finally, deserting himself, reduces the whole number of 6 or 7 capable of bearing arms. Captain Willoughby resolves, however, to defend his post. His son is the juncture, pays him a clandestine visit, and endeavoring to reconnoiter the position of the Indians, is made a captive. The captain, in an attempt to rescue, is murdered by the Winnedot, which vindicative passions have been aroused by ill-timed allusions and on the part of the Willoughby to flogging previously inflicted by his own orders upon the Indian. Winnedot, however, having satisfied his personal vengeance, is still an ally of the settlers. His guides Maud, who he believed by Robert to be hut in which the latter is confined, and effects his escape. Aroused by his escape, the Indians participate the attack upon the knoll, which, through the previous treachery of the Strides in ill-hanging a gate, is immediately carried. By Willoughby, Belia, and other of the parties are killed. Maud is secreted and thus saved by Winnedot. And the last moment, when all be apparently lost, a reinforcement appears under command of Everett Beacom, the husband of the Belia, and the completion of the massacre of prevented. Woods, the preacher, has left the knoll and made his way through the enemy to inform Breekman of the dilemma of his friends. Maud and Robert Willoughby are, of course, happily married. The concluding scene of the novel shows us Winnedot remaining the murder of Willoughby and converting to Christianity through the agency of Woods. It will be seen, though, that there is nothing original in the story. On the contrary, it is evenly excessively commonplace. The lover, for example, rescued from the captivity of the mistress, the knoll, carried through the treachery of the inmate, and the salvation of the besieged is at the very last moment by the reinforcement arriving in consequence of a massacre borne to a friend by one of the besieged without a cognizance of the others. These, they say, are accidents in which they have been common property to every novelist since the inventions of letters, and for the plot there have been no attempt at anything of the kind, the tale of which mere succession of events, scarcely any one of which has any other necessary dependence upon the other plot. However, it is best an artificial effect requiring, like music, not only a natural bias but long cultivation of taste for all of its full appreciation. Some of the finest narratives in the world, Ballast Glass and Robinson Crusoe, for example, have been written without its employment. The Hutted Knoll, like all the sea and forest novels of Cooper, have been made deeply interesting, although depending on the particular source of interest, not at all. Thus, the absence of the plot can never be critically regarded as a defect, although its judicious use in all cases arising in no case injuring others' effects must be regarded as the very high order of merit. There are 1 or 2 points, however, in the mere conduct of the story now before us, which may perhaps be considered as defective. For instance, there is too much obvious in all the appertains to the haranguing of the large gate. In more than a dozen instances, Mrs. Willoughby has made to allude to the delay of the hanging, so that the reader is too positively and pointedly forced to perceive that this delay is the result of the capture of the knoll, as we are never in doubt of the fact that we dismiss interest what it actually happens. The single vague illusion, well managed and will have been in the true artistical spirit. Again, we see too plainly from the first that Beekman is to marry Delilah and that Robert Willoughby is to marry Maud. The killing of Delilah and Miss Willoughby and Miss Jane Allen produces, too, a painful impression which does not properly appertain to the right of fiction. Their deaths affect us as revolting and supererogatory, since the purposes of the story are not thereby furthered in any regard. To Willoughby's murder, however, distressing the reader makes no similar objection, merely because of his decrees of fulfilled a species of poetical justice. For may have observed here, nevertheless, that his repeated references to the flogging of the Indian seem unnatural, because we have otherwise no reason to think of him as a fool or a madman, and these references, under the circumstances, are absolutely insensate. We object also to the manner of which the general interest is dragged out or suspended. The besieging party is kept before the knoll so long, so little is done, so many opportunities of action are lost, and the reader takes it for granted that nothing of consequence will occur, that the besieged will finally be developed. He gets accustomed to the presence of danger, and his excitement at length departs. The action is not sufficiently rapid. There is too much procrastination. There is too much mere talk for talk's sake. The interminable dimensions between Woods and Captain Willoughby are perhaps the worst feature of the book, for they may not even merit referring to the matters in hand. In general, there is quite much colloquially to the purpose of manifesting character, and too little of the explanation of motive. The characters of the drama would have been better made out of action, but there the motives to action and reasons for the different courses of conduct adopted by the dramatis personae might have been made to proceed more satisfactorily from their own mouths in casual conversations than that of the author in person. To conclude our remarks from the head of the ill conduct of the story, we may commend occasionally incidents of the merest melodramatic absurdity, as, for example, on page 156, the second volume, where Willoughby had an arm about the waist of Maud and bore as forward with a rapidity to which her own strength was entirely unequal. We may be permitted to doubt whether a young lady of sound heart and limbs exists within the limits of Christendom, and could not run faster than her own proper feet for any considerable distance, than she could be carried upon one arm of either the Cretan Milo or the Hercules Farnese. On the other hand, it would be easy to designate many particulars which are admirably handled. The love of Maud Meredith for Robert Willoughby is painted with exquisite skill and truth. The incident of the tress of hair in the box is naturally and effectively conceived. A fine collateral interest is thrown over the whole narrative by the connection of the theme with that of the revolutionist, and especially there is an excellent dramatic point at page 124 of the second volume, where Wynnedotte remembers the stripes inflicted upon him by Captain Willoughby, is about to betray him to his foes, when his purpose is arrested by the casual glimpse through the forest of the hut which contains Mrs. Willoughby, who has preserved the life of the Indian by inoculation for the smallpox. In the depicting of character, Mr. Cooper has been unusually successful in Wynnedotte. One or two of his personages, to be sure, must be regarded as little worth. Robert Willoughby, like most novel heroes, is a nobody. That is to say, there is nothing about him which may be looked upon as distinctive. Perhaps he is rather silly than otherwise, as for an instance he be confessed to all father's arrangements for his concealment and bursts into the room before strides, afterward insisting upon accompanying that person to the Indian encampment without say possible or impossible object. Woods and Parsons, as a sad pour upon the Demille Sampson plan, and is more ever caricatured. Upon Captain Willoughby we have already spoken, is too often in stilts. Even Beekman and Belia are merely epipistical. Joyce is nothing in the world of Corporal Trim, or rather Corporal Trim and Water. Jamie Allen, with the prate about Catholicism, is insufferable. but Mrs. Willoughby, the humble, shrinkingly woman, whose whole existence centers in her affections, is worthy of Mr. Cooper. Maud Meredith is still better. In fact, we know no female portraiture, even in Scott, where she surpasses her, and yet the world has been given to understand by the enemies of the novelist that he is incapable of depicting a woman. Joel Strides will be recognized by all who are conversant with his general prototypes of Connecticut. Michael O'Hearn, the country letterman, is an Irishman all over, and his portraiture abounds in humor, as, for example, on page 31 of the first volume, where he has sufficiently difficulty with a skiff not being able to account for his revolving upon his own axis instead of moving forward, or at page 132, where during divine service to exclude at least a portion of the heretical doctrine, he stops one of his ears with his thumb, or at page 195, where a passage occurs so much to our purpose that we will be pardoned for quoting it in full. Captain Willoughby is drawing his son up through a window from his enemies below. The assailants place a distance from the window to avoid observation from without, and ignorant or what somewhat brethren at the end of the rope. The man did as ordered, raised their load from the ground of 2 feet at a time. This manner the brethren approached, yard after yard, until was evidently drawing near the window. It's the captain hoisting up the big baste of a hog for provisioning the hose against the sage, whispered Mike to the negroes, who grinned as they tugged. And when the crowder squalls, see to it that they do not squall themselves. And that moment the head of the shoulders of the man appeared at the window. Mike let go of the rope, seized a chair, and was about to knock the intruder upon the head, but the captain arrested the blow. It's no one of vagabonds, Injuns, and their understanding the hog, and come in its stead, roared Mike. It's my son, said the captain. See that ye are silent and secret. The Negroes are, without exception, admirably drawn. The Indian Wyandot, however, is the great feature of the book, and is in every respect equal to the previous Indian creations of the author of The Pioneer. Indeed, we think this forest gentleman superior to the other noted heroes of this kind, the hero for which we have been immortalized by our novelist. His keen sense of the distinction in his own character between the chief Vandervat and the drunken vagabond, Sassy Nick, the chivalrous delicacy toward Maud in never disclosing to her that knowledge of her real feelings toward Robert Willoughby, which her own Indian intuition had discovered, his enduring animosity towards Captain Willoughby, softened by her 30 years delayed through his gratitude to his wife, and then the vengeance consummated, his pity for the wife conflicting with his exhalation of the dead, and these, we say, are all traits of the lofty excellence indeed. Perhaps the most effective passage of the book, in which that which most instinctively brings out the character of the Trescarola, is to be founded in pages 51, 2, 3, and 5 of the second volume, where for some trivial misdemeanor the captain threatens to make use of the whip, the manager of which the Indians harp upon the threat, returning to it again and again in every variety of phrase, forms one of the finest pieces of mere character painting with which we have any acquaintance. The most obvious and most accountable faults of the haunted knoll, and those of the appertain to the style of the mere grammatical construction, for in author and more important particulars of style, Mr. Cooper of late days has made a very manifest improvement. His sentences, however, are arranged with an awkwardness so remarkable as to matter of absolute astonishment. When we consider the education of the author and his long and continual practices with the pen, the minute descriptions of localities and verbal inaccuracies or confusion because of the source of vexation and misunderstanding, distracting very much of the pleasure of perusal, and in these inaccuracies Wyandot abounds. Although for instances we carefully read and reread the portion of the narrative which details the situation of the knoll and the construction of the buildings and walls about it, we are forced to proceed with the story without any exact or definite impressions upon the subject. Similar difficulties or similar causes occurs passion throughout the book. For examples, The Indian gazed at the house with that fierce intentness which sometimes glared in a manner that had got to be, in its ordinary objects, dull and despoted. This is an utterly impossible to comprehend. We presume, however, that the intention is to say that although the Indian's ordinary manner of gazing had got to be dulled and besotted, he occasionally gazed within an intense that glared, and that he did so in the instance in question. We got to be is atrocious, the whole sentence no less so. Here is something excessively vague of the latter character of the face of most of the region, which lies in the angle form of the junction of the Mohawk and the Hudson, etc. The Mohawk joining the Hudson forms two angles, of course, an acute and obtuse one, and without further explanation, it is difficult to say which is intended. The captain, owing to the English education, and avoided straight lines and formal paths, giving to the little spot the improvement on nature which is consequence of embellishing her works without destroying them, on each side of this lawn with an orchard 30 and young, and which are already beginning to show signs of putting forth their blossoms. Here we are tautologically informed that the improvement of the consequence of embellishment, and surgatorily told that the rule holds good only when the embellishment is not accompanied by destruction. Upon the each orchard were, it is needless to comment. There is something similar where strides it represents is neither doing anything that requires a particular more than the exertion and strength that were absolutely necessary to effect this object. Did Mr. C ever hear of any labor that required more exertion than was necessary? It means to say that the strides exert himself no further than was necessary, that's all. He was advancing by the only road that was ever traveled by the stranger as he approached the hut, or he came up the valley. This is merely a vagueness of speech, or as intended to imply, that is to say, the whole would be clearer thus. He was advancing to the valley, the only road traveled by the stranger, approaching the hut. We have here seen 16 words instead of Mr. Cooper's 25. It is in pardonable awkwardness, although the awkwardness strictly grammatical. I was a favorite, I believe, was much petted by both. Upon this we need make no further observation, it speaks for itself. We are aware, however, that there is a certain air of unfairness in thus quoting detect passages of an adversion of this kind. We, however, strictly at random, our quotations may rarely be. We have, of course, not means for providing the fact of the readers, and there are no authors for whom the works are individually inaccurate. Sentences may not be culled. But we mean to say that Mr. Cooper, no doubt through haste or neglect, is remarkably and especially inaccurate as a general rule. And by way of demonstrating this assertion, we will dismiss our extracts at random and discuss some entire pages of his composition. More than this, we will endeavor to select a particular page upon which it might naturally be supposed that we would bestow the most careful attention. The reader will say at once, let this be the first page of the preference. This page then shall be taken, of course. The history of the borders it fills with legends of sufferings of isolated families during the troubled scenes of the colonial warfare, which those are now offered to the readers are distinctive of many of their leading facts, if not rigidly true in the details. The first alone is necessary to the legitimate objections of fiction. Abounds with legends would be better than is filled with the legends. For it is clear that if the history was filled with legends, it would be all legend and no history. The words of, too, occurs to the first sentence with an unpleasant frequency, and those commencing the second sentence grammatically refers to the noun scenes, which immediately receding, but is intended for lengths. The adjective distinctive is vaguely and altogether improperly employed. Mr. C, we believe, means to say merely that although the details of his legend may be not strictly true, facts similar to these leading ones have actually occurred. By one of these words, distinctive, however, has been contrived to convey a meaning nearly converse. In saying that this legend is distinctive in many of the leading facts, he has said that he clearly did not wish to say that his legend contained facts which distinguished it from other legends. In other words, facts never discussed in other legends and belonging to particular to his own. That Mr. C did mean that we suppose is rendered evident by the third sentence. The first alone is necessary to the legitimate object of fiction. This third sentence itself, however, is very badly constructed. The first can refer grammatically only to the fact, but no much reference is intended. If we ask the question, what is meant by the first? What alone is necessary to the legitimate object of fiction? The natural reply is the facts similar to the leading ones have actually happened. The circumstances alone to be carried for this consideration alone is necessary to the legitimate objects of fiction. One of the misfortunes of the nation is to hear nothing besides its own praises. This is the fourth sentence and is by no means lucid. The design is to say that the individual's composition of nature and living altogether within the national bounds hear from each other only praises of the nation, and that this is misfortunate to the individuals, since it misleads them in regarding to the actual condition of the nation. Does this sound relevant to today? Here it will be seen that to convey the intended idea, we have been forced to make distinction between the nation and its individual members. Mean like federal and states' rights? For it is evident that a nation is considered as much only in reference to other nations, and thus as a nation it hears very much besides its own praises, that is to say, it hears the detractions of other rival nations. It's America first. In endeavoring to compel this meaning within the compass of a brief sentence, Mr. Cooper has completely sacrificed its intelligibility. The fifth sentence runs thus: although the American Revolution was probably as just an effort as was ever made by the people to resist the first inroads of oppression, the cause of its evil aspects, as well as the other human struggles, the American Revolution is hereby improperly called an effort. The effort was the cause of which the revolution was the result. The rebellion is an effort to effect the revolution. The inroad of oppression involves the untrue metaphor, for unroad appertains to aggression, to attack, to attactive assault. The cause of this evil aspect, as well as all other human struggles, implies that the cause is not only its evil aspects, but had also all other human struggles. If the words must be obtained at all, they should be thus arranged. The cause, like or as well as all other human struggles, had its evil aspects, or better thus, that cause had its evil aspect, as have all human struggles. Other is superfluous. The sixth sentence is thus written: we have been such accustomed to hear everything extolled of late years that could be dragged into the remotest connection with the greatest event and the principles which led to it, that there is danger of overlooking truth in a pseudo-patriotism. Does this sound relative? 1935. Of the late years, here should follow the accustomed or proceed that we have been with the Greek pseudo is objectionable, since its exact equivalent is to be found in the English false. Spurious would be better perhaps than either. Inadvertencies such as these sadly disfigure the style of Hooded Knoll, and every true friend of its author must regret his intention to the minor morals of the muse. But these minor morals, it may be said, are trifles at best. Perhaps so. At all events, we should never have thought of dwelling so pertinent upon the unessential demerits of Wyandotte, could we have discovered any more momentous upon which to comment. That is the end of J. Fenimore Cooper's lessons for today. I would like to read one more poem. I'm out of Emily Bronte poems, so now I'm reading her sister, Charlotte. I don't know if I read this yesterday or not. Life, believe, is not a dream, so dark as sages say. Oft a little morning rain foretells a pleasant day. Sometimes there are clouds of gloom, but these are transient all, and the shower will make the roses bloom. Oh, why lament its fall? Rapidly, merrily, life's many hours flit by. Gratefully, cheerily, enjoy them as they fly. What though death at times steps in and calls our best away? What though sorrow seems to win, or hope a heavy sway? Yet hope again elastic springs, unconquered through she fell. Still buoyant are her golden wings, still strong to bear her swell. Manfully, fearfully, the day of trial bear. Gloriously, victoriously, can courage quell despair? That is the ends of the lessons today for Mr. Poe and Miss Bronte. If there's any truth or relevancy in what I'm doing here, please like and share and subscribe.